My name is Laura. I'm 32 years old. I was folding laundry on a Tuesday night when my mother-in-law called and told me my husband had been in a terrible accident. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept saying his name over and over. Mark, Mark, Mark. I looked across the hallway and my husband was standing in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. Completely fine. I laughed a little and said, "Mom, he's right here. He's standing 10 feet away from me." She went silent. Then she started crying harder. Before I tell you what I found when I got to that hospital, please like this video, subscribe to Heartway Stories, and drop your country in the comments below. Now let me tell you everything. My husband Mark and I had been married for 4 years. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday party in Chicago, the kind of crowded apartment gathering where you end up having a real conversation with someone in the kitchen because the living room is too loud. He was leaning against the counter eating chips and reading the labels on the host's hot sauce collection like it was genuinely interesting to him. I thought that was the strangest and most charming thing I had ever seen. We talked for 3 hours. He asked for my number before I even thought to give it. Mark worked in commercial real estate. He traveled sometimes, not constantly, but enough that I had learned to appreciate the quiet evenings alone and appreciate the loud ones with him even more. We had a small house in a suburb outside of Chicago, a rescue cat named Pepper, and a life that felt genuinely good. Not perfect. Real. The kind of good that you stop noticing because it becomes your normal. That Tuesday, Mark had come home from a 2-day trip to Minneapolis. He seemed tired but happy. We had dinner together, talked about nothing important, and then he went to the kitchen for water while I started on the laundry. That was when the phone rang. My mother-in-law Patricia's voice was shaking so badly I initially thought someone had died. She said Mark had been in a car accident on the highway outside the city. She said he had been taken by ambulance to Mercy General. She said it was serious. She said I needed to come now. I walked to the kitchen doorway. Mark was standing there, glass in hand, looking at me with his eyebrows slightly raised. He mouthed, "Who is it?" I held the phone out toward him, like it proved something. I said, "Your mom thinks you're in the hospital." He frowned. He came over and took the phone and spoke to her calmly. I watched his face. He looked confused but not afraid. He told her there must have been some kind of mix-up. He told her he was fine. He was home. He had just gotten back from Minneapolis a few hours ago. He handed the phone back to me and shrugged like we had just been asked to confirm a restaurant reservation. Patricia would not stop crying. She said she had seen him herself. She said she was already there at the hospital. She said his wallet was with him, his ID, his wedding ring. She said, "Laura, please, just come." Mark told me I should probably go just to sort it out. He said mix-ups happen sometimes, especially with wallet theft, cases of mistaken identity. He said it would give Patricia peace of mind. He squeezed my hand and said he would stay home with Pepper and I should call him when I figured out what was going on. Something about the way he said it felt reasonable. Logical. So, I grabbed my jacket and drove to Mercy General. Patricia was waiting just inside the entrance doors. Her eyes were red and swollen. She grabbed both my hands the second she saw me and pulled me down the hallway without saying a word. I kept telling her it was okay, that Mark was at home, that I had just left him, that there was clearly some confusion. She shook her head and kept walking. She stopped outside a room in the ICU. A doctor met us in the hallway. He introduced himself and asked if I was Mark's wife. I said yes, but that I thought there was some kind of mix-up. He nodded carefully, like he had heard this before, and then he opened the door. The man in the bed was connected to monitors. His head was bandaged on the left side. His right hand rested on top of the blanket, and on his finger was a gold band, simple, slightly worn on the inner edge. Exactly like the one Mark had worn every day since our wedding. I stepped closer. The man's face was bruised and swollen, but even through the swelling I could see the shape of his jaw, the particular way his nose turned at the bridge, the small raised scar just below his left ear that Mark had gotten from a childhood bicycle fall. Patricia had told me that story on our second Christmas together. My legs went strange underneath me. I grabbed the foot of the bed. The doctor spoke quietly. He said the man had been brought in after a serious collision on the interstate. He said he had lost consciousness at the scene and had not yet woken up. He said his ID identified him as Mark Delaney, my husband, with our home address. I stood there looking at that face. I had kissed that face 10,000 times. I knew every line of it. But I had left my husband standing in our kitchen 40 minutes ago. I told the doctor there had to be a mistake. I told him I knew it seemed impossible, but my husband was currently at home. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said they would certainly want to clarify the situation. He said perhaps I should contact my husband and ask him to come in. I walked out into the hallway and called Mark. He answered on the second ring. His voice was warm and easy. He asked if I had sorted everything out. I said I needed him to come to the hospital. He paused for just a moment. Then he said, "Of course, give me 20 minutes." I sat with Patricia in those 20 minutes. She kept holding my hand, and I let her because I didn't know what else to do. The man in the ICU room was breathing steadily. Machines kept track of every beat of his heart. I kept thinking about the scar below his ear. I kept thinking about the wedding ring. When Mark arrived at the hospital, Patricia stood up immediately. She looked at him, then she looked at the room. Then she looked back at him. Her face did something I had never seen a face do before. She sat back down without saying a word. Mark was calm. He spoke to the doctor. He said he understood the confusion, but he was clearly standing there, healthy, uninjured. He said someone had stolen his wallet on his trip to Minneapolis. He had meant to tell me but had forgotten. He suggested the accident victim was likely someone who had found his ID or stolen it. He was polite, articulate, reasonable. The doctor took notes. I watched Mark the entire time. He seemed like my husband. He sounded like my husband. He touched the small of my back the way my husband always did when we were standing together in a group. We drove home separately. When I got into bed that night, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Mark fell asleep quickly. I listened to him breathe. I told myself the wallet explanation made sense. I told myself I was exhausted and frightened and that my brain was doing something irrational with the fear. I told myself the man in that hospital bed was a stranger who happened to resemble my husband in the dark logic of coincidence. People looked like other people sometimes. It happened. I almost believed it. The next morning, I went back to the hospital alone. I told Mark I was going to a client consultation. I sat beside the unconscious man for 40 minutes. I studied his hands, the particular thickness of his knuckles, a small callus on the right index finger from holding a pen. Mark had that callus. He had always complained about it when he wrote for too long. I had teased him about it. I had kissed it once, laughing. On an ordinary Sunday morning, I went home and made dinner and smiled at my husband across the table and said nothing. Days passed. I kept going back to the hospital. The man in the ICU remained unconscious but stable. The doctors kept him under observation. Each time I sat beside him, I left more confused than when I arrived. And each time I came home, the man waiting for me was so completely, convincingly, Mark that I began to question my own memory. I began to wonder if grief or stress was distorting my perception. I had read about trauma doing things like that to people, but small things kept happening. Tiny things that I could not explain away. Once, I mentioned a restaurant Mark and I had gone to on our first anniversary. I said something offhand about the pasta we had shared. The man across from me smiled and agreed it had been wonderful. The restaurant we had actually gone to for our first anniversary did not serve pasta. We had gotten sushi. I had made a joke about it being an unusual first anniversary choice, and Mark had laughed and said he would have taken me anywhere I wanted. It was one of my favorite memories of him. I said nothing. I kept my face still, but something cold moved through my chest. Another evening, I called for Pepper, and the cat came running to me from the hallway. Mark had always called Pepper by a nickname, Pep the Dep, which was a ridiculous name that had no logical origin but had stuck somewhere in our first year together. I had never told anyone else about it. I watched the man sitting on the couch and said, "Have you fed Pep the Dep today?" He looked up from his phone and smiled. He said he had. Then he went back to scrolling. The smile had come just slightly too late. Half a second. Maybe less. I went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and pressed both hands flat against my knees to stop them from shaking. I had been sharing a home with this man for weeks. I had been sleeping in the same bed as him. I had been eating meals he cooked and watching television beside him and saying goodnight to him in the dark. And I had no proof. Nothing I could take to anyone. Nothing that would make a single person believe me when I could barely believe it myself. I did not go to the police. I want to explain why, because I know the obvious question. The reason was simple and terrible. I had nothing. A missing restaurant memory, a half-second delay, a nickname he had used correctly every other time. I was a woman claiming that the person living in her house was not her husband. I was a woman who had been taken to the same hospital twice and shown the same unconscious man and had stood there without being able to say with certainty which one was real. No officer was going to act on that. And if the man in my house was actually an imposter who had gone to whatever lengths were necessary to be here, then tipping him off before I had real evidence would be the most dangerous thing I could do. So I waited. I watched. I smiled at dinner, and I kept going back to the hospital, and I started quietly, carefully, looking for anything I could find. My older sister Claire worked for a law firm that handled civil litigation. She had access to research tools and record databases that most people did not. I had not told her anything yet because I had not been ready to say the words out loud. But one evening, she called me and her voice had that specific tone, careful and deliberate, that told me something had already shifted. She said she needed me to come to her office. She said to come alone. She said not to tell anyone where I was going. I told the man at home that I had a late client meeting. He kissed me on the cheek before I left. I sat in my car in the driveway for 30 seconds after that and breathed through my mouth until the nausea passed. Claire locked her office door before she said a word. She told me she had been concerned about me for weeks. She said I had seemed different, quiet in a way that was not like me, and that she had started paying attention. She said she had done something that might seem like an overreach, but that she needed me to see it before she explained. She opened her laptop and turned it toward me. The footage was from a private medical clinic in Arizona. Security camera quality, a little grainy, but clear enough. The timestamp went back 14 months. A man entered the clinic wearing a baseball cap pulled low. When he turned toward the intake desk and removed the cap, I recognized him immediately. His name was Ryan Calloway. He had been Mark's college roommate. He had come to our wedding. He had been to our house for dinner a handful of times over the years. I had always found him a little intense, a little too focused on Mark. The kind of friend who seemed to need more from the friendship than the friendship could reasonably give. But I had never been afraid of him. He had just been a person on the edge of our life. Claire clicked forward. More clips. Ryan returning to the clinic. Consultations. Pre-surgical documentation. Then, over the course of nearly a year, a series of procedures that I could not have imagined were possible outside of fiction. Photographs from each stage. A face changing incrementally. Jawline, nose, hairline adjustments. Scar tissue carefully added beneath the left ear. My vision went strange at the edges. I pressed my fingers against my mouth. Claire said she had cross-referenced Ryan's financial records through the civil research tools available to her firm. She said Ryan had liquidated nearly everything he owned over the past 2 years. He had no remaining apartment lease, no active subscriptions, no digital footprint after a certain date. He had been methodically erasing himself. She said she had also pulled records from the clinic itself, which had been flagged in a previous unrelated malpractice case her firm had handled. Among the documentation was a psychological evaluation required before the procedures. The evaluating therapist had noted an obsessive pattern. The patient described, in clinical language, a fixation on a specific woman and a desire to inhabit the life of the man she was with rather than simply take her away from him. He did not want to steal her. He wanted to become the version of himself that already had her. I sat with that for a long moment. The version of himself that already had her. Claire took my hand. She said there was something else. She had called the hospital. Not as my sister. As a researcher. She had asked specific questions about the unidentified accident victim who had been brought in weeks earlier and who remained in the ICU with disputed identity. The accident had occurred on the same interstate where Mark's business trip to Minneapolis would have taken him home. A truck had run a red light at a highway on-ramp. The collision investigators' report noted it had not appeared to be a random accident. The truck had no registered owner. The driver had fled on foot and had not been located. It had been arranged. Ryan had arranged for my husband to be taken out of his own life on the same night he intended to step into it. I cried in my sister's office for a long time. Not loudly. The kind of crying that doesn't make much sound, that comes from somewhere deeper than grief, from the specific horror of realizing that something you thought was safe had been a lie you could not have detected. Every dinner, every night in the dark, every time I had reached for his hand, believing it was the hand of the man I loved. Claire told me not to go to the police yet. Not alone. She said she had already contacted an attorney colleague who handled criminal cases and that we needed to move carefully. She said Ryan was intelligent and had been planning this for a very long time. She said if he suspected anything, the evidence could disappear, and he could disappear with it. She said we needed to give him a reason to stay exactly where he was. I drove home that night and made popcorn and sat beside Ryan Calloway on my couch and watched 40 minutes of television and said goodnight and went to bed. And I did not sleep, but I did not let him know that. Over the following 3 weeks, I became a different kind of person. I became someone who smiled while her hands were gathering rope. Claire's attorney colleague guided me through what we needed, and I found each piece with the patience of someone who understood that moving too fast would cost everything. Bank transfers between Ryan and the surgical clinic, 18 months of records. Text message threads recovered from a phone Ryan had used prior to his disappearance. Communications with the driver of the truck that had hit Mark's car. Security footage from the clinic, time-stamped and authenticated. A document from the surgical team's internal files listing the specific physical characteristics of the target subject, Mark's height, his weight, his distinguishing marks, including the scar below his left ear, which Ryan had requested be replicated precisely. I found one more thing on my own. In the back of the closet in our home office, in a box that was supposed to contain old tax files, I found a notebook. It was filled, from cover to cover, in handwriting I did not recognize, with details about my life, my schedule, my preferences, things I said often, the name of my hairdresser, the coffee order I got every morning, the nickname I used for the cat, notes about my relationship with Mark, written from the outside, the way someone studies a subject they intend to replicate. Some of the entries were dated as far back as 3 years ago. He had been preparing to become my husband for 3 years before he did it. I photographed every page. I put the notebook back exactly where I had found it. The meeting was arranged through Mark's business attorney, who had been brought in carefully and quietly by Claire's colleague. It was framed as a routine update on Mark's real estate portfolio, a semi-annual financial review that the attorney said required both signatures on several authorizations. Ryan had been pushing for weeks to gain formal legal authority over Mark's business accounts. The attorney confirmed the meeting with him easily. Ryan confirmed without hesitation. The morning of the meeting, I got up early and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the yard. Pepper came and wound around my ankles. I picked her up and held her against my chest for a minute. I thought about Mark in that hospital bed. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake beside the wrong man. I thought about the notebook in the closet. Then I got dressed and drove downtown. The conference room had a long oval table and tall windows looking out over the city. Claire was there. The attorney was there. 2 people I did not recognize sat along the side wall and did not introduce themselves, but I knew who they were because Claire had told me. Ryan arrived in one of Mark's suits. He looked confident. He sat beside me the way a husband sits beside his wife. He shook hands with the attorney and made a small joke about the weather and smoothed his jacket over his knees. The documents were placed in front of us. The attorney reviewed the terms. Ryan listened with the patient, knowledgeable expression of a man who had studied real estate vocabulary carefully. He nodded at the right moments. He asked one precise question about a holding structure. I watched him and thought about how long it had taken him to learn to do all of this, how many months of practice, how much of himself he had spent becoming someone else. The attorney set a pen in front of me. Ryan turned toward me with a small, encouraging smile. I picked up the pen. I looked at the documents. Then I set the pen down and said, quietly and clearly, that before we signed anything, I wanted to show everyone something. Ryan's smile stayed in place for exactly 2 seconds after I said it. Then his eyes moved to the screen on the far wall, which the attorney had just switched on. The surgical footage was the first thing that played. 14 months compressed into 4 minutes. a face changing in increments until it matched the face that was now sitting beside me at that table, pale as paper, completely still. I did not look at Ryan while the video played. I watched the screen. I heard his breathing change. I heard him shift in his chair. I heard the small sound he made that was not quite a word and not quite anything. When the video ended, the two people along the side wall stood up. One of them said Ryan Calloway's name in a voice that made the room feel very small. Ryan stood. He knocked his chair back. He said my name once, just Laura, with an urgency that I had no way to interpret and no desire to. One of the officers took his arm. He did not fight. He seemed to understand, in that moment, that there was no version of this he could talk his way out of. He looked at me once more, something in his face that might have been grief or might have been rage, and then they walked him out of the room. The door closed. The room was quiet. Claire was beside me immediately. She put her arm around me, and I let her hold me there for a little while. The charges against Ryan Calloway were extensive. Identity fraud, impersonation, conspiracy to commit murder. For what had been done to Mark on that highway, 2 additional charges connected to the surgical clinic's criminal operation, which was under separate federal investigation by the time the case went to court. The trial took several months. I testified twice. The notebook was entered into evidence, and the prosecutor referred to it repeatedly. Ryan sat at the defense table and looked at the floor during most of the proceedings. His attorney argued diminished capacity. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. He received 35 years. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, said she had never encountered a case that demonstrated such calculated, sustained, methodical cruelty toward another human being and another human life. I sat in that courtroom and heard the verdict and felt something I'd been holding for months slowly leave my body. Mark woke up 6 weeks after the accident. I was in the room when it happened. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and then turned his head toward me. He looked confused and exhausted, and like the most familiar thing I had ever seen in my life. He tried to say my name, and it came out rough and quiet. I took his hand. I held it for a long time without saying anything, just sitting with a specific, irreplaceable feeling of knowing exactly whose hand it was. His recovery took nearly 5 months. There were surgeries, physical therapy, weeks when the progress was so slow it was difficult to measure. I came every day. Sometimes I brought Pepper in her carrier and set it on the chair beside the bed, and she would make her particular chirping sound at him, and he would smile even on the days smiling was difficult. He had a lot of questions. I answered all of them, everything, from the beginning. He listened without interrupting, which had always been one of his qualities, the ability to simply hear something fully before responding. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said he was sorry. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He said he felt sorry anyway, that I had carried it alone for so long. I told him I had not been entirely alone. I told him about Claire. He asked me once, a few weeks into his recovery, how I had known for certain. With everything being so confusing and nothing being provable for so long, how had I known that I needed to keep looking instead of accepting the explanation I had been given? I thought about that for a while before I answered. I told him I had known because of the pasta. He looked at me blankly. I reminded him about our first anniversary, the sushi restaurant, the joke I had made, the way he had laughed. He smiled slowly. He said he remembered. He said he had actually been nervous that night and had eaten too fast and had embarrassed himself a little. I told him the man in our house had agreed with me when I mentioned pasta at that restaurant. He had agreed immediately, with total confidence, because he had studied everything about our life except the specific texture of the moments he had not been present for. He knew the facts of our history, but he did not know what it had felt like to actually be there. And in the end, that was the thing that could not be copied. The thing that could not be surgically reconstructed or learned from the outside or rehearsed in a notebook. He did not say anything. He just turned my hand over in his and looked at it. We went home together on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn. The house felt different and also exactly the same. Pepper greeted us at the door with complete indifference, which was correct cat behavior, and made us both laugh. I had repainted the living room while Mark was in the hospital, partly because I had needed something physical to do with my hands during the worst weeks of waiting, and partly because I had wanted the room to look different when he came back. He stood in the middle of it and looked around. He said he liked the color. I told him I had gone back and forth about it for 2 weeks. He said it was the right choice. We ordered Thai food that evening and ate it at the kitchen table and talked about small things, the neighborhood, a book he had started reading in the hospital, a renovation project I was working on for a client. Ordinary things. The best kind of things. At some point, Pepper climbed into the chair between us and settled in with the complete authority of a cat who had decided where she wanted to be. Mark reached over and scratched behind her ears. He said, "Hey there, Pep the Dep," in exactly the voice I remembered. I looked at him across the table. The kitchen light was on. His coffee was getting cold because he always forgot to drink it while he was talking. There was a small scar below his left ear that had been there since he was 9 years old, falling off a bicycle in his parents' driveway, in a story his mother had told me 2 Christmases ago. I knew exactly who he was, and that, after everything, was the thing that mattered most.